Hello, everyone. It's very good to be here with you today. As you can tell, we have another serving of tax. We're going to talk a little bit more about FATCA and specifically how it could apply if you're a non-U.S. fund investing in the U.S. For non-U.S. funds investing in the U.S., when the U.S. makes payments to the fund, there is potentially now this new 30% withholding tax. And so for those of you who are somewhat familiar with this new package of legislation that has been rolled out over the 2013 to 2017 period, you will understand that FATCA will permanently alter the ease and the manner with which you could invest in the United States if you are a non-U.S. fund or a financial institution. Okay, so formerly there would not be, or there very well may not have been a requirement to file a U.S. return if you were a non-U.S. fund, or so long as you did not have any U.S. accounts or U.S. investors. This is no longer the case, and so the future as far as investing in the U.S. is that if you invest in the U.S., you can expect there to be a requirement to have to file a U.S. return. And so our objective today is really to help you identify whether you have an obligation, and if so, what you can do in order to minimize your tax liability and the costs of compliance. Okay. So just to give a quick background, this legislation was really directed at U.S. persons who were investing overseas and not paying U.S. tax on those investments. And so given the political and economic climate in 2010, the U.S. was able to enact this package of legislation. However, due to the burdensome nature of this legislation, the Treasury Department within the U.S. decided that it was appropriate to delay the implementation and phase in the implementation over the 2013 to 2017 period. Today we're going to give some specific examples of how FATCA would apply with respect to your U.S. inbound investments, so that way you're able to identify whether or not you have some kind of either a reporting obligation or withholding obligation. We're also going to talk about specific kinds of indebtedness that may be exempt, and in this case there is an opportunity to reduce your costs, and potentially FATCA would not apply in this little carve-out. The IRS has provided some kind of a reprieve. And finally, we're going to go over a trap for the unwary. There's a very unique set of tax laws within the U.S. That can give rise to a deemed disposition of your debt placements, and so it can give rise to a hidden tax cost. Okay, so the stick as it relates to FATCA is that FATCA requires non-U.S. entities, especially non-U.S. funds and financial institutions investing in the U.S., to execute a reporting agreement with the IRS or otherwise face a 30% withholding tax. And so as you can imagine, this is really a very strong incentive to execute an IRS reporting agreement. So what's involved? When you enter a reporting agreement, what kind of information are we going to have to provide? Well, for non-U.S. financial institutions, or what's commonly referred to as FIFIs, they agreed to provide information to the IRS concerning accounts of U.S. investors, accounts of recalcitrants, folks who are investing and will not cooperate with the non-U.S. funds' due diligence procedures, and finally, information concerning investors in the FIFI that are also either non-U.S. funds or other financial institutions that do not have an IRS reporting agreement in place. And so naturally, given that historically the industry has not been required to provide this information previously, this makes everyone very queasy. the other significant concession on the part of a fee for entering into a IRS reporting agreement is that they agree to essentially act as a withholding agent for the U.S. government. So a fee with IRS, a fee with an IRS agreement, while payments to the fee won't be subject to withholding, the fee agrees to withhold potentially a 30% tax to payments of certain of its investors, specifically recalcitrant accounts and other fees without a reporting agreement. So I'm going to pause here because I think I've succeeded at sucking all the air out of the room. Sorry?
No, my question is for clarification, so I want to make sure I'm understanding what is the intention behind these rules. So FATCA, as initially defined, already is this commitment of passing the individual information from the foreign entities into the U.S. And now you are talking about, but these are foreign entities that are not operating in the U.S. And now it seems to me here that the target is these foreign entities, but operating at a certain level in the U.S. Am I understanding this correct?
No.
No.
So that's actually a very good question. FACTA is much more broad than that. It applies to non-U.S. financial institutions, whether it be funds or banks. Certainly in the case of a non-U.S. fund, if they are investing in the U.S., then FACTA will potentially apply to them. And so it sounded like the question was whether or not you needed some kind of a physical presence or some kind of a nexus to the United States and beyond. You do not need more than an investment. And so we're going to go through some specific examples. But as you can see here, if you have an investment in shares of a U.S. corporation, or if you have investment in U.S. indebtedness, then FATCA potentially applies to payments on those shares, dividends, or payments of interest on the debt placement in the U.S. It also would apply to the disposition of the shares in a U.S. corporation, as well as the disposition of indebtedness of a U.S. borrower. Correct. So the implementation of the provisions are being phased in over a period, and so those top two items, withholding applies to those kinds of payments effective July 1, 2014. So although folks have been talking about it for quite a while, it's really only recently that there is an affirmative obligation to withhold. Now, with respect to the last two, those also subject to the phase-in provisions are effective as of January 1, 2017. Okay, so let's talk about, let's go through a specific example. Here we have Swissco in 2014 making a loan to a U.S. co, and there's no IRS reporting agreement that's executed by Swissco. And so on January 1, 2015, when we have an interest payment from U.S. co to Swissco, since Swissco has not executed an IRS reporting agreement, that interest payment is going to be subject to 30% withholding. And so it's pretty clear that there is sufficient incentive for Swissco here to enter into an IRS reporting agreement. Now, the other big significant application of FATCA is, as you can see, on the date of maturity, it would also apply. And so there would be a 30% withholding on the repayment of the debt in 2019. So there's very significant incentive here for U.S. inbound investors to enter into a reporting agreement. Now, just going a little bit further down the rabbit hole, in this hypothetical, we have a loan again by Swiss fund into U.S. co. However, Swiss fund enters into a reporting agreement, and however, Swiss fund has a fund of fund above that's investing in Swiss fund. And so fund of funds, unfortunately, does not enter into an IRS reporting agreement. And so you can see that in 2017, when there's an interest payment made by U.S. co. to the Swiss fund, there's no withholding required on that payment because we have an IRS reporting agreement in place. However, by virtue of its reporting agreement, Swiss fund that is, Swiss fund agrees to act as withholding agent on behalf of the U.S. government and would withhold 30% of the allocable share of income which would be flowing up to fund of funds. So one of the things that fund might consider is there's a potential election that a fund can make to delegate its withholding obligation to U.S. co. And so this might help to reduce some of the compliance costs as far as costs associated with withholding.
Excuse me to interrupt, just 2-3 minutes, okay,
sure.
To come to a conclusion. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, certain debt obligations are exempt from withholding. These are referred to as grandfather debt obligations. And so if you were the holder of a grandfather debt obligation, you would not, any payments on this kind of indebtedness would not be subject to withholding. And so as far as these debt obligations, if you had held old and cold debt, you may not be subject to FACTA withholding. So the message here is really understand your obligations. Understand what kind of indebtedness you've invested in. Also, there's a unique provision in the U.S. Sometimes where circumstances have changed, such as where the creditworthiness of the borrower has changed or there are changes in the credit markets, parties may desire to amend the terms of their lending. And so we have a unique provision in the U.S. that where this occurs, there can be a deemed debt-for-debt exchange. Now, the reason why that's relevant is because if you were the holder of a grandfathered obligation, you would be deemed to retire the grandfathered obligation in exchange for a new obligation. And so, whereas you wouldn't be so concerned about FATCA on the grandfathered obligation, the holder would be deemed to receive a new obligation subject to FATCA. Also recall that FATCA potentially applies on the disposition of indebtedness. So that 30% can result in a hidden tax cost where there's an amendment to the lending arrangement and the parties are not paying attention to this.
I can see. The next speaker is just getting the micro, so just a very, very quick question that we can stay on schedule. Very quick.
But if you have an offshore fund and you are an investor there, and obviously the offshore fund must then comply with the IRS, but if there are no U.S. tax subjects as investors in this offshore fund, this doesn't apply, or am I wrong?
If you're an offshore fund and you're investing in the U.S., FATCA will apply. However, the withholding tax will not apply so long as you enter into an IRS reporting agreement. So there's still an obligation to enter into the agreement, and as part of the terms of the agreement, you would essentially certify, simplifying of course, but you would certify that I do not have any U.S. investors, and as a result, this 30% tax would no longer be withheld.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jonathan Tiegerman, for your information. We'll have the chance to ask questions also during the break. Darlene Hart will be available as well during the break. They informed me that they will stay towards the end, or also for the drinks reception, hopefully. Now I see that our next speaker is ready. We go to the... Thanks, indeed.